our third, I think it's our third Institute of Risk Management Complexity and Risk Special Interest Group. Been quite a lot happening over the last few months in the sphere of complexity and risk. So opportune for us to just meet up, share experiences, and we're very fortunate to have Elizabeth from Houston We Have to give us a little presentation on augmented intelligence and the work they've been doing on AI and decision analysis in particular. But Elizabeth will take us through that in a moment. And we've also very kindly been joined by, sorry, I just lost my connection there, I thought. Yeah, we're joined by Jennifer Daffron, Dr. Jennifer Daffron from Cambridge Judge Business School. And she's offered to contribute to a discussion on business risk complexity. So our agenda will be about 30 to 40 minutes on augmented intelligence from Elizabeth, a little closeout discussion, and then we'll have about 20 minutes on business risk complexity with Jennifer, and then we'll just have a closeout on what we want to do going forward, and if we want to initiate any studies between this meeting and the next, or suggestions for speakers. Greg and I are jointly hosting, and apologies for any sort of hiccups in the presentation. We're both quite new to this software, so we do have Rory from the Institute of Risk Management to guide us should we have any issues. But hopefully everybody will be able to see and hear presentations. Don't think we've had any more people join in the last few minutes. Oh yes, we have. Yeah, got Charles from CAMS Group. Yeah. Okay, shall we press on? So Elizabeth is going to give us a discussion on augmented intelligence. Elizabeth is the CEO and founder of Houston We Have, which was an interesting name. I tried to Google it, but all sorts of strange things come up when you just Google Houston We Have. But I obviously Elizabeth will give us a great insight. But this is some really interesting stuff on how to use AI, human-centered, and lots of great work. Sounds like with the Australian Defence in particular, but much wider application in the ability to use modern techniques and modern software that can handle complex maths to process information and overcome a common problem we have in risk management, which is the subjectivity, the bias that humans introduce into our perception of risk. So the more we can overcome that bias and get much more objective assessments of risk, then I think the more validity will be given to the risk management process. And so this sounds like a really interesting application. I think Elizabeth is prepared to take questions as we go. Is that right, Elizabeth? Okay, great. So without further ado, if more people join, I might have to just break off and explain, but hopefully people will pick it up as they go. Sure. So I'll hand over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I am going to share a presentation in a moment, which means I will lose any chat questions that come up as my screen disappears. And what I might do, just to ensure my bandwidth remains, I will turn off my camera so that I can present two things. I'm going to go through a couple of slides just to give some context for who we are and how we might fit within this realm of risk management. And then secondly, I'd like to take you into the software, not to give you a detailed tour of it, but to give you at least a flavor of what it's capable of doing. So let me turn off the camera and flick across and share this presentation. One moment, please. Now it's telling me that I'm sharing, and I'm going to change my window. So can you see, Houston, we have?
Yes, I can see that.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. So as we've already said, it's augmented intelligence, and I will touch on why we talk about it being augmented rather than artificial, which is the typical word for AI when people talk about it. Gartner, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the analyst group, described our software as software that offers a unique type of prescriptive analysis, one that tackles the difficult strategic end of the decision spectrum. Prescriptive is an important word. It is predicting a future state or a future likelihood or the outcome of an event, and actually indicating why. So it's not just the answer is 42, it's going to tell you why it's 42. And as we go through this presentation and we take you into the software, you'll start to see how we differ from other AI tools and other analytic tools. We are Australian, and the technology was originally designed for a requirement by the Defence Intelligence Organisation. That is a world that is lacking data. While we are all swimming in data lakes, the reality is that within many sectors of the Defence Force, there is not a lot of information available to them to make decisions. And in fact, what they're typically dealing with are what they can see. So what are the observations that we can make about this situation? Or what are my opinions of a person, a group, a scenario, based on my experience typically? And as we've already alluded to, subjectivity is something that drives most of our decision making. We tend to be subjective and then we rationalize it. But that subjectivity creeps into our decision making all the way. But in a world where we're lacking information, such as the defense space, the reality is they don't necessarily have anything else to go on. And so our software takes and blends the world of the known, the quantitative information that we can gather, and it blends it in a rigorous, disciplined, repeatable way with our subjectivity. And so we're creating an objective view of that opinion, that intuition, that gut feeling that we might have. And it's allowing us to defend that position that we take. Our software produces two elements. It produces a likelihood of that event and it produces a certainty. How confident are we in that likelihood? Again, I'll show you some examples of that. But we're very clear. It is a completely transparent outcome. It isn't simply a number or two numbers. It is going to detail exactly what is pushing it in favor, what is detracting it from it being a particular position, and also what information might be missing. So that's where we started our journey. And what we've discovered is that many organizations across industry have very similar problems. And despite the amount of data that we have available to us, there are so many times that organizations simply take that data and still have to figure out what to do with it. And it ends up being, well, what does my gut instinct tell me to do? Or what do I think is the right thing to do? So we're here to create that layer of objective decision making. And you'll see in that the list there of our channels, we are involved in insurance. We have 17 private health insurance companies as our client base. We have scenarios where we assess the investment worthiness of various ventures. We run scenarios in credit risk assessment for lending platforms, and we sit behind legal applications where they try to get ahead and actually understand the likelihood of winning the case and therefore what the right strategy should be. I mentioned artificial and augmented. Our goal here is to put the human at the center of everything. Your experience as risk managers is really, really important to everything that you do every day and to every piece of information and system that you use. So we like to start with you at the center of that and actually understand the problem from your perspective and from the other stakeholders' perspective. We can use the data that's available, obviously, to try and understand the patterns and the trends that exist within it. But our goal is not to replace, in this case, the risk manager. Our goal here is to support all the things that you have to do, all the decisions that you have to make, and allow the software to do all the heavy lifting. Because the reality is, as human beings, as intelligent as we all are, we are all limited in how many things we can deal with in our brain. The research shows that at best we can deal with 3 or 4 things. And as we've already mentioned, we all come at this with a particular bias. And it's not necessarily a bias that's bad, it's just simply that sometimes I get blindsided by the things that I am very used to, and I don't see the bleeding obvious in front of me. So our goal is to augment and support the human so that you end up making better decisions, and in your scenario, understand the risks across your project and understand how one small thing can cascade and change the overall cost, time to delivery, or quality of the project that you're running. So, augmented intelligence for risk managers. What might we bring to it? It creates a layer of simplicity. Now, I have looked at risk registers in the past, and they are very complicated pieces of usually Excel spreadsheets in my experience. Now, I don't begin to understand your world, be very clear, but I was thinking about one example today that we worked on for one of the major banks here in Australia, and they had identified 700 risks for a major project that they were working on, and it was very costly. It was about $3 billion worth of investment. And we took that spreadsheet and we put it into our software, and we made it far easier for the C-level people in that organization to understand every piece of risk and understand how each of those risks affected their final decision. And it created a visual aspect, and they knew the things that they had to turn off, they knew the areas they had to mitigate, and where their focus really had to be. So cut through the noise to focus on the things that were important. As we build the models, we can build correlation into them from the ground up. So it's in place from the moment you start. We are going to produce a more accurate representation of your risk. Again, whether it's quantitative information or whether it's subjective coming into play, we're going to bring it all together into one place, and you will have an ability to see with accuracy and greater transparency exactly where you are at any point in time. We create this auditability, this trail that shows you a date and time stamp. It shows you the output, the outcome that's where you are today, and it shows you every single thing that has contributed to that position. So we end up with this transparency, and ultimately we can start to think ahead. What are the fires that we actually might have to face? What are the things that we might have to deal with? Are there any black swan events that might creep into the mix? And can we plot that in a scenario that says, if that happened, what might the result be on our project? And start to think beyond the curve. Actually, instead of looking behind you in the rear vision mirror of your car, you know, the things that you've already seen, the places that you've already been, what's around that corner? What are the risks that we might have to deal with, so that if they should start to appear on the horizon, you are better prepared for them? The golden triangle. Now, this is something that's relatively new to me, but all of these elements here are elements that come into your world of risk management. The scheduling, the cost of the project, the scope of it, and the quality of the deliverables at the end of the day. Our goal here would be to take that and actually underpin what you're doing within that risk register. In fact, we probably could replace that risk register so that we end up with something where the data can be automatically ingested, if that's something that's possible. Automate that ingestion of information, automate the assessment every single time a new piece of information comes in, so that you are on top of the risks immediately and you understand the cascading events of that risk across the entire project. So we would understand the key factors that impact the cost, the time, and the quality. And as I said, every risk change that comes in, it could be something that is manually inserted through, it could even be inserted through an Excel spreadsheet if that's what was your preferred option. But at the end of the day, we can capture the information from whatever source it happens to be sitting in, put it through the model, run the assessments, and you know where you are today at this date and time. So it ends up supporting you in your risk management role, but it also supports that workflow. And hopefully what it ends up doing is making your job far easier. Now, this is nothing other than just a simple representation of what a dashboard could potentially look like. Now, each of these are radars that show a slice of the pie, which is the likelihood. The amount of color radiating out from the center is the certainty. How confident am I in this example here that I'm going to be on budget? So it says that it's 70% likely and 68% certain. So we've got quite good confidence around this particular position at this point in time. Underneath it, we have different elements that are pushing it to be at this place. These are some of the risks that have been identified. Amber could be that it's a medium risk, whereas the red is the element that really needs to be dealt with right here, right now. Depending on how the dashboard was created, it might be this that you then click through and it drills you down into even more detail sitting behind it, so that you really understand. For example, the metal price has increased. Well, what has it increased to? And drill through to that. So ultimately, how you want to interact with our software, whether that's through a dashboard as an end result, whether it's hidden away behind all the systems that you happen to use. The reality is that the model can be built to reflect, in effect, the risk register that you currently create. And it can be built in such a way that it automatically produces you an assessment of risk at a given time, or every time new information comes to light. Now, I'm going to go from here and actually into the software. And I only want to do a very high level of view of that. So I'm going to change screens again. And so if you can just confirm that once the screen comes up, that you can see that, please.
Does anybody have any questions at this time? If you want to use the chat line just to raise any questions.
Nothing at the moment.
No. Greg. Greg asks what data is being brought in.
It can be absolutely anything. We are agnostic. So we can connect into databases and basically ingest record by record from a database. In fact, this example that I'm about to walk through did exactly that. It could be sitting in at the back of a website. We could grab information from the back of the website. It could be structured, unstructured. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. We offer industry standard APIs. so that we can connect into wherever the data happens to be. But importantly, Greg, the information that comes in is very specific to the model itself, which is what I can explain in this at this point here. Thank you for your question. If there's no more questions, I might take you on a quick tour of this software. So we've popped the hood and we've come into the kind of the engine room of the software. It is designed for analysts, and the analysts will build the model. So let's say it's your risk register representation. You would build it in here, and then once you've built it, we can deploy it wherever and whatever shape you'd like it to take. So for example, we have organizations that build their models here like this, and then they host them for use inside an Amazon Web Services deployment. It could be held in Azure, or for defense, it's held in a top secret environment within their own servers. So it can be on-premise, it can be hosted, but I actually am running this on my laptop at this point in time. So it has various configurations depending on your need. So in this environment, we create in your case, the risk register. We would define the problem that we're trying to solve in this environment. And we do that by starting, first of all, to understand what are the issues we're trying to resolve. Now, in this example that I've got in front of me, this was a model that was built to help resource companies, so mining companies, manage their inventory stock. So if you are a large mining company sitting in the middle of Australia, where you're surrounded by nothing but thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of red dust, you can't just pop down to the local hardware store when you need another washer. So their stores, their inventory has to reflect the elements that they need out at that site. The goal here was to prevent a production line from going down. And as you can imagine, if we're digging up coal or iron ore or anything else for that matter, if that production line stops, then there are going to be millions and millions and millions of dollars of consequences. And it has happened where mines have had a piece of equipment break and they have been offline for several months. So the focus of this model was, let's identify the impact on that production line and how critical that is. But we also need to understand who the suppliers are and where they are. But in the mix of all of these parts that we have, we've got spare parts, we've got things that are just general consumables like the washers. There are various different types of equipment that we have. And for some of these pieces of equipment, I also know that, for example, I can modify another piece of equipment and use it for a completely different purpose. So in this landscape, they're trying to ensure that they have the right piece of equipment on site all the time in case something breaks. So then, of course, we also have to understand, how often do these pieces of equipment actually break? So the complexity is getting larger and larger, and the risks are getting larger and more. So here in this definition, the first question we want to understand is, what is the impact on our production line? Now, it's classified A through to E, where A was low impact to E being high impact. But each of these, in order to answer whether it's an A or an E, I have to understand more about who the suppliers are. I need to understand more about the material. And then you'll see I've now got these folders underneath. If I drop down just one of these, you'll see that all of a sudden I now have all of these other folders that tell me a whole pile of other issues that we need to start taking care of. In fact, if I show you this view of the issues here on the left-hand side of the screen, what it reminded me of today was when I looked through this outline view of all the issues, it kind of reminded me of an Excel spreadsheet where we list all the risks and we're able to then identify the possibilities. All that really happens here in this first step is identify every single risk in your project. That's all we're doing here, exactly as you do when you create a risk register. So all of these elements all go together in some way, shape, or form through a series of relationships and influences to eventually answer the question, what is the overall impact on our business? That's step one. Now, what happened in this example, the model was built. We took the model in on a piece of hardware. It was plugged into their database, Greg, just a standard relational database. And then every record from the database was extracted. It ran through this model, and then it went back into the database with an update. Now, why did we have to do that? We did that because if there are 3 million parts sitting in a database, and there's a couple of people whose part of their role is to keep that database updated with criticality factors, what actually was happening was the database was not being kept up to date. And so therefore the inventory could not reflect criticality because the source of truth was, well, it wasn't accurate. So what various resource companies had determined was that if you leave it to a human to do, it's likely to take several years before that database is then updated. And like the Forth Road Bridge in Scotland, you're probably starting again from the beginning and repainting it all over again. You're starting again to keep those criticalities up to date. So that was the first thing. The second thing that they found was, of course, as human beings, do we have the capacity to actually understand the criticality for 3 million parts? Possibly not. And so the accuracy level of the database, even if it was updated with a criticality factor, was out of whack. So we were able to save on time and increase their accuracy using a model that updated their database and kept that criticality in place based on not only the data that we knew about the parts, but actually talking to the people who work in the mine, whose job it is to repair the equipment, the guys who are in the store, who can say with their gut instinct, you know, we go through so many of those washers every week because that particular piece of equipment breaks them every couple of days. They know it because they live and breathe it, but it's never in a database. So we're combining the world of data and human expertise and creating this model, which means it becomes something that is highly repeatable. So it doesn't matter if one of these guys goes off on a long summer break, the model will work there and allow that register of risk to be updated, the inventory to be updated. Therefore, the risk to their production line coming down is then minimized. So we start by explaining everything that makes up this total question up here. The second part of this, I'm not going to go through it, just describes how all of those issues hang together. And this is a representation. It's not the reality. It's a representation for within this model here. But the bottom line is these blue guys, in defense intelligence, a source can be a person. So we have little bodies to sort of indicate elements, but the blue are sources of information. This could be my database. This could be the inventory manager, for example. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't really matter. But we add data in, and we can add it manually into the system sitting here, or we can trap it through the APIs. The yellow guys, these yellow guys, are where the smarts of the engine come into play. So we've defined the problem, we've defined the relationships and how all those elements hang together, we've provided some information, and then what happens is we create this, this object which we call the virtual analyst. And what the virtual analyst does is it takes direction from us, and it can say, all right, what I want you to do is assess the risk here, and I want you to assess the risk looking at it through this lens. Now, if you're sitting in a project where you have multiple partners, you're in a consortium scenario, and each partner obviously looks at risk in their own way, it may be that you use this model to show different perspectives of the same project and focus in on each partner's area of interest and therefore their associated risks. So I could run an assessment and I could look at one partner's view of the project and see where their risks sit. And I could then look at it through another partner's view. And then I can bring it all together and I can have an entire project view to see how each partner is contributing to us not making our deliverable on time and in budget. As a quick example, I'll just show you one example here. So this yellow guy here has run an assessment and it's all about that primary business impact. Each time I run an assessment, I get a date and timestamp. So you'll see each one is date and time stamped. There's our start of our audit trail. So if anybody ever comes to us and asks, why did it go off the rails at that point in time? Or why did you make that decision at that point in time? You can go back to that date and you can see why. In the top left-hand corner, it's telling us that the business impact here is, it's 77% likely, but we also have an E at the other end there, 23%. We've got all these other little ones. I was playing with the data earlier. It makes no sense, but just to kind of give you some output here. So we've got a 77% likely and we've got an 84% certainty on this result. What the system then does is it shows us why. Let me just hide that. And it allows us to get to a place where we can start to drill down and understand what is pushing it up in that particular way. So here's the level of transparency coming through. So this is my top level result. And what it does is it shows me what has contributed to that position. I can follow any of these paths. 3 blue arrows are pointing up and pushing the result up. And it's because we have a production consumable type of material in play and that it's actually not an obsolete part. You'll also see here, it says from reliable fields. Now, if you looked at those blue elements that we had earlier, reliable fields is one of the sources. Now, why is that important? Because if I go back down to that for a second, what it's telling me is this piece of information came from this source. So you have this cross-referencing within the output so that you know who gave you that piece of information. So again, if you're looking at it across multiple partners within a consortium, you can see who has provided that information and therefore what impact it has on this overall top result. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot of going on this screen. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, we've had a question from Charles.
Sure.
He seems to have cut straight to the chase, suggesting this is quite expensive. How did you create the business case? Was it very cost-based?
So in this particular example, this was a service that was provided to the resource companies. If I tell you that there is one 3-letter mining company who believes they have 600 million in obsolescence in their inventory, then it's not necessarily that expensive, is it? Not that you necessarily know the price of this, but there's an immediate saving. This was sold as a consulting assignment because they wanted to update their databases and bring them up to accuracy, so that they could then have a knock-on effect to their stock control. And the typical consulting assignment was about $50,000. If you've got obsolescence and you try to get rid of $600 million worth of obsolescence, that's not an awful lot, really, in the scheme of things, is it, Charles?
Charles responds in agreement. A question from me, if I may.
Sure.
There's obviously sort of the input data. I'm still not sure where you get the sort of the risk and uncertainty information from within what's primarily objective data, but it sounds like you then augment that with people's perceptions and perhaps project inflowing of information to support that data. But how do you test the reliability of that? You obviously said that you've got reliable fields and less reliable fields. How do you know which ones are good and which ones are suspect?
Okay, so forget. I mean, so these are the testing guys' terminology here. Forget the name of the field, these sources for the moment. This can be a database. This could be an SAP system. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. When quantifiable data comes in, so we know that it's a hard number, right? It's 15%, it's 100 of this or 10 of that, then what you have is 100% certainty, because it's a known fact. It's a number, it's a fact. And so your certainty, so the more color you've got, then the greater your certainty. Where you see, for example, let's see if we've got something here. So here you'll see, for example, on capital, we've got less color. So there's less certainty around this. Why is that important? Because that's probably a subjective view of that particular issue. So hard numbers and facts get 100% certainty, confidence in that number, whereas our subjective view of things gets picked up. I might say to you, will Trump win the next election? How likely do you think that is?
There's a sort of an objective opinion, and there's an aspirational opinion.
Yeah. So what's your opinion, though, Mike? I mean, do you think that he's likely? Is Trump likely to succeed in the next election? If you look in that drop down on the left-hand side, we might say it's
I'd say it's 50-50 at the moment. I would say.
Right, okay. All right. So it's 50-50. So the chances are about even, right? There you go. So chances are about even. So it's 50-50. But I might also ask you about how you feel, how confident you are in that, because sometimes, I can say he's likely to get in, and how confident you are in that. I'm not really confident. It's just that most presidents will get a second term. That's history, right? But I'm not sure that he's going to get in given everything that's going on. So there's two dimensions to my feeling, right? There's how likely I think it is and how confident I think it is. And those two elements can be captured as part of the input. So, and they can be captured through surveys. We can simply just add it straight into the model itself. But where we find people are using subjective input, it's through, usually at the moment, it's usually through either some sentiment analysis, where we might run some algorithms over content and pick out how people are feeling about various things. Or you have a survey and you ask people to answer a set of questions. And you can ask both of those, how likely and how confident are you? And we can combine those into, in effect, one answer. But when we get the result back, the result actually shows us that two-dimensional output of sorry, I'm in the wrong one, of likelihood and certainty. So this one here. So the color telling us how confident we are in this result. But every other piece of data, if it's available, then we can find a way, usually through APIs, to get to it. It may be that we do some other AI capability to bring data together from different sources, to analyze it, to aggregate it. Sometimes we have to clean it. Sometimes we've got to, find some of the nuggets that sit within the data that people don't necessarily understand or know about. And they can actually form either part of the model build itself, or in fact, they can become the information that we ingest into the model. And in this example, each of these become an information point. Anything that's sitting in here is a place where we can look for evidence. Now, one of the interesting things about our patent is that while it blends the known with the quantitative with the qualitative, it can also deal with the concept of unknown. Our software can run an assessment even if we have information missing, and it can produce usually with a high degree of accuracy, a result, even if you have lots of missing elements within your assessment. And the other reality is, as we've kind of alluded to, is you can change one thing and it will cascade down through to show you the result. I might just bring up another model just for the sake of just showing you. This model is, we run this for mergers and acquisition scenario. We've got lots of different elements here, but when it comes to assessing, I can run an assessment and that's it, it's done. And clearly that was quite quick. I didn't change any data, but just imagine that we've just inserted some new data. But the speed at which I can produce an assessment when new information comes in is like that, which means if you are running a risk register, you can have new information come in either manually or otherwise, and very quickly I now start to see where my problems are, red flags pulling everything down, and where I might now have to focus my attention in order to change this result. Right now we're about 52%. I need to get this up here. I need to know that I'm going to be on time, within budget, and deliver what's been asked. Now I can see exactly where all my red flags are.
And Demetrius has asked,
sure.
So the tool can differentiate between subjective data and objective data, can it?
It's not that the tool itself is differentiating between it. It's how we trap it within the data, within the model itself, and represent that. So quantifiable data is represented in 100% certainty. So numbers and facts are 100%, whereas subjective input tends to have that lower color. So let me just see if I've got a couple. I'm sure I've got a few more examples here. So here, less color, less color. You see I've got a lot more color here. This is most likely to be some hard numbers coming in. It means that you can 100%, so there are many bidders, 100% likelihood and 100% certainty. And what this does is there's a numeric measure. It's what it's called, Dimitri, and it tells me that there are 3 bidders in this mix. So we can represent numbers, but as I said, it's about, you'll get this 100% certainty. That's subjective. This is someone's view of their due diligence. There's missing data there. We don't have any information there. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Is that fair, Demetrius? Great, yes.
Cool, wonderful. Does anyone want to see anything else? If not, then I'm happy to take any final questions and ask if there are problems that you would like Houston Rehab to solve.
Oh, it's great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Oh, interesting.
Pleasure.
It's interesting you pick up on, you mentioned towards the end that the software can pick up missing data. I was reading a fascinating article by Professor David Hand at Imperial College the other day, who talks. I think he's produced a book about why we need to care about missing data. But he talks. He clearly illustrates that the stuff that we don't know is equally as important as the stuff that we do know.
Absolutely.
And as soon as we start making decisions to exclude certain data, or we go to sources which aren't complete, then we're immediately going to have an inadequate capacity to make the pragmatic decisions. So it's fascinating that you can overcome that.
Because we can supplement it with the bottom line is we can supplement it with what's available. And that is typically the humans who are sitting in the room, who have been living and breathing that particular scenario. The approach has always been, if it's not in the data, then we can't get the answer. Our patent is allowing us to take what humans have been doing for centuries, and we're tapping into that knowledge and that experience, and we're surfacing it in a piece of software, which means it's repeatable. And when we know that we're now missing this piece of information, it means we can now go and find it, but we can still get an assessment of risk while we look for that data. And what we might find is that piece of information, which we thought was really important, actually may not be that important to our overall risk anyway. So do we need to find it?
Right. Okay. So it's not extrapolating beyond known data to fill voids. It's identifying the void and then asking questions about where you might get that information from.
Well, what it allows you to do is very much focus on what's necessary. But what happens as a consequence of gathering information, what we find is that, particularly when it comes to deployment of forces into various scenarios, where do you need to put your effort? And if we've got a boat sitting out in the sea and it's about a 7-day trip out to get them, we want to be really sure that that boat is an issue before we start sending people out there. So what are all the indicators? What are all the warnings? What is the information actually telling us? So don't waste your effort sending somebody out there. And while I'm in this midst here, we've got all of this information about this boat. What are the things that are really important? Because sometimes we think we need to know more about a situation, but sometimes the things that are really driving the overall decision or the overall risk may actually only be a handful of things. And we're getting blindsided by all of these other pieces of information that don't really influence the final outcome. So one of the consequences of some of the projects we worked on is it allows people to put their focus on the things that are important. What are the things that we need to deal with to increase our success? And where else can we just avoid? Because actually that looks okay. It's not going to make a difference really to our eventual project risk or success.
No, great.
Yeah, Mike, just as a quick introduction, I'm Graham Miller. I'm a risk management consultant. I've been given a bit of advice to Izzy and the team as to how this software can really add value to risk management. But I think what we're talking about there is the correlation function here. I think that's one of its real strengths, how it can actually drive the decision-making process. So and what Izzy was saying, there's a cascading of risk information which is showing you the consequences of impacting risks and how they travel down the chain of events. So you can really focus your efforts, and as Izzy said, in some instances you're going to see that actually this isn't really having much impact further down the line, so we want to focus our efforts elsewhere. And factoring in the human factors, the heuristics and the bias really manages to fill in some of those gaps. I think that's where we are with it.
Actually, that's a good point, because what's interesting at times when you work with organizations is you can build a model and then you can immediately see where the bias has been built into the model. And what's important then is you make a decision about, is this a bias that we need to keep, or is this a bias that we remove? Because there are times and places where a bias is actually important. And there's a couple of examples. So in that mergers and acquisitions scenario, there was one case where the CEO was going to get a nice big fat bonus for selling his company in effect. And so there was a bias placed on his information, or rather there was a weighting placed on his information because everybody knew where he was leaning. In other scenarios, for example, in your various projects, if you're digging a tunnel, there may be elements about digging that tunnel because you've done something in a similar place. You might know elements about the makeup of that landscape and the rock that you're dealing with. And therefore, you can immediately put, if you like, a bias to say, we know that this rock is damn difficult to drill through. So there may be elements of that risk register that reflect the problem because you already know it, you already understand it, you already understand the complexity behind it. So bias isn't necessarily always bad. It's recognizing the world that you're living in and how it currently is framed.
Mm-hmm. And I think the mentioning of the mergers and acquisitions piece, I think that's transferable to option selection and figuring out or the portfolio management, for example, which projects should we be progressing with? What are the impacts of omitting this project from the portfolio and progressing with another? So yeah, I think it's got a lot of applications out with just the standards risk management kind of setting.
Great. No, thank you for that, Graham. Yeah, no, it's some interesting insights. I think you touch on problems that we've all encountered and we're all trying to find solutions for, which is this overcoming bias. And the crux for why we formed the SIG in the first place, which is that we recognize that the existing techniques that we've been using for sort of 20, 30 years really don't understand complexity well. The standard packages that you buy, the software packages, they purport to do correlation, they purport to understand the domino sequences of and multiple dominoes that emerge from butterfly wings. But they clearly don't, and it's very hard to use those particular applications. So tools and techniques that allow us to augment our linear understanding of risks with the dynamic understanding of how risks actually affect organizations is really interesting. Demetrius asks, can the tool deal with opportunities? Obviously threats being upsides and downsides. Can we add in the potential for upsides into the picture?
Absolutely. So there's the sales opportunity view of the world. There's a kind of extrapolation of what Graham was just talking about and looking at various projects and the opportunities, bearing in mind that where this was originally conceived was to try and understand the threat of a scenario and what opportunity there was to mitigate the risk for the Australian Defence Force. So I know that seems a bit kind of strange to me perhaps to say that, but the reality is if you can describe it, if you can describe that problem, either by describing it through your experience or using that alongside data that you might have, then we can map a model and run and test it for you.
Fascinating. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was fascinating.
Not a problem. I will stop sharing my screen.
Great. Okay. Well, and obviously, everyone go and have a look at the website in a bit more detail. And clearly, Elizabeth's contacts are there if you, or Graham, or the other colleagues, please get in touch with them. Interesting food for thought.
Thank you so much. So
next, what we were going to do was talk about complexity in the business world, and I know there's considerable efforts being put into this by many different organisations with copious volumes of information on how we should be considering the COVID-19 scenarios at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, we're kindly joined by Dr. Jennifer Daffron, who's from Cambridge Judge Business School, and she's kindly offered just to give us a flavour of what the school has been doing over the last few months, and what big organisations are struggling with, and perhaps where they've been successful, and maybe some examples of where things haven't been successful. Hi, Jennifer, I can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yep, I can, Jennifer. I hope the other, hopefully you can.
Are you able to hear me?
Yep, it sounds like that's a positive. Great, over to you. Hello, Jennifer.
Sorry, I'm not sure if this is working on my end. Oh, you can hear me. Fantastic. I'm just gonna keep going with that. For some reason, the permissions on my computer are not allowing me to connect the webcam. But I just wanted to say that was a great presentation, Elizabeth. Combining the data between combining human expertise and data is something that we are constantly working with at the Judge Business School in trying to understand the risks that businesses are facing right now. And you kept mentioning how these risks are getting larger, and we're absolutely seeing the same thing. Not only are they getting larger, they're getting far more complex, and they are becoming more interconnected than we had previously imagined. We just hosted a risk summit just this past week, and I saw that Dimitris has to jump off of the call pretty soon, so I'm just going to put these into the chat so he has access to them. For this risk summit that we just had, we were looking at what makes a company resilient, and resilience is no worries, Dimitris. Resilience is what's key right now. We've had winners and we've had losers in response to COVID-19, and we want to understand what is it about those companies that's allowing them to succeed in these uncertain times. And very much to what Elizabeth was talking about, it's understanding your risks, but not only understanding your risks in isolation, but it's seeing how they connect to each other. The Center for Risk Studies systematically identifies the correlation and loss potential for each of the threats in our global risk index. So that's things like market crash, sovereign crash, interstate war, earthquakes, floods, power outages, human epidemics. All of these different things are in our risk register. And we try to see not only each scenarios for each of those individually, but we also try to understand the ability of each of those threats to trigger other extreme events, because I think that is what's really been key in this COVID-19 crisis. Is when we look back at our risk matrix of correlations between the different types of events, human epidemic never hit above a 3 to be correlated. It's out of a scale of 0 to 4. Never really hit a correlation of over 3 with any of our risks. So seeing that, a human epidemic could be increasing the amount of cyber attacks that it has recently was not something that we'd really even thought about until now. But it's those companies that are challenging themselves to identify not only the risks themselves, but how those risks are interconnected are what's going to really cause them to be resilient. So that's the first main point of resilience that we covered. And we have risk flashes, so little 5-minute tidbits on how COVID-19 has affected geopolitical risks, governance risks, financial risks, cyber risks. and how the role of insurance and resilience in social media. And we had lots of presentations by outside speakers from the center, which you can now have access to since it was online. And I think that the key thing with COVID-19 isn't that these risks were necessarily well, they are obviously bigger than we imagined, but it's the speed at which these risks became significant is the key to what's happening here. So the resilience of a company is not only having a backup plan or having backup vendors, it's the speed at which you can roll out those backup vendors, or that you're able to transition to a work from home environment that's just as secure as your in-house working environment. I'll stop there because obviously there's lots to go through that we went through on the summit, but I'd love to hear what you all are interested in response to COVID-19 and resilience.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Yeah, it's going to be interesting how people assess the probability of another viral attack, because it's always fascinating that the probability of it happening might have been right. People assessing it as a 3 out of a scale of 4 sounds, quite a high probability if that was the matrix. But what people definitely underestimated was the level of impact. And I think some of the work that Greg's been doing in particular is to sort of move away from using probability as the primary driver and say, let's look at the impact first. And clearly our risk matrices that have, this supposedly finite scale for probability and impact is flawed, because probability can never go above 100%, but impact has got an infinite capacity. So there's definitely something flawed in our typical 5x5 matrices. So I think it's going to be fascinating how we as a risk community guide companies going forward to assess that in the future.
Can I make a comment? And what we're seeing here in Australia is lots of initiatives by the government, and the impact, as you were saying, but it's not just the consequences of the policy change or the funding or anything else. It's the unintended consequences that no one thinks about. And I guess my frustration is that we kind of follow a trajectory that says, if we do this, then it will change everything and it will all be fantastic. But we don't take a step back and actually try to look at it from a broader community perspective. And so while we say everyone's into lockdown, we don't think about, well, what does it mean when you're in lockdown? What does it mean if you can't easily access food and all of the necessities? What if you're in an abusive relationship? What if you live alone? What if? There's a benefit to the community, but what were all the unintended consequences that we hadn't really thought through, we weren't prepared for? So we then find ourselves in situations where we have higher rates of domestic violence, we have higher rates of homelessness as a consequence, we have higher rates of potentially divorce coming out the back of it, and mental health issues. And so it would be wonderful if we could find a way to look at particularly COVID and potentially a second wave and take a step back and say, who are all the stakeholders that we need to be communicating with? Who do we need to collaborate with? This is not just people sitting in the heart of London in Downing Street with their policy hats on and Treasury trying to figure out whether or not we can afford it. It's this broader community, and I think we need to have greater engagement there to really truly understand the unintended consequences. As much as we're trying to do good, what might we be doing that isn't good? And how do we assess that risk? And therefore, how do we mitigate it?
No, that's a really good point. I do have a lot of empathy for crisis managers. I was
earlier in your conversation was about the heuristics and biases, and I think what's going to happen in light of COVID-19 is we're going to start to see which populations and which stakeholders, as you said, have been overlooked in our calculations, and how the differences in socioeconomic status have impacted the spread of COVID-19 in different areas, and how that therefore will impact the market of those different areas.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. I think the interesting thing from my perspective is I was a crisis manager for Lend-Lease, and exactly at the time where 9/11 happened. It's a long time ago now, 2001, but I can still remember it quite vividly. And you can't preempt what the consequences are at the time of actually managing the crisis. And obviously, the more you can run scenarios, the more you can try and consider the event, then the more prepared you'll be. But you just have to make pragmatic decisions at that point in time, and deal with what emerges continuously. But I think what's fascinating from a risk perspective is how you can obviously learn from hindsight for that particular event, but how do we advise organizations when the event is an unknown? So we're speculating about, and clearly climate change and all the potential impacts of that is probably going to be the most significant event that most businesses are going to face over the next 15-20 years. How do we as risk managers actually advise organizations of what they need to invest now, and potentially massive investment, to be able to overcome that scenario?
It's also taking off our typical hat. And if you think of 9/11, no one ever envisaged that planes would fly into buildings like that. And in understanding those one-offs, those black swan events, the reality is we do have to get creative, and we do have to challenge each other when we sit around a room planning about how do we mitigate this crisis if it should occur. And being prepared, and you're right, you'll never be 100% prepared, but having a methodology, having the tools to hand that allows you to very quickly scenario plan and figure out where your greatest bang for your buck is going to be in order to solve the problem or at least mitigate it. And that fast response time.
Use of scenarios in these cases are exactly what we try to do at the Center for Risk Studies to get people to expand their imaginations a bit. Whenever I've been in risk manager meetings about when September 11th is brought up, it's talked about as a failure of imagination, that we couldn't possibly think that this could have happened. However, when we think of COVID-19, about in the early 2000s, we released a scenario, the Sao Paulo pandemic report, and it's not too far off of actually what's happening. The key thing that we missed is the human reaction. That's the thing that we keep bringing up here, and I think that's one of the reasons myself as a psychologist was brought on to the team, is because when we're doing these risk analyses, we need to not only remember that we're looking at the bottom line of a business, we're looking at a business that is made up of people, and people who are making those decisions.
No, great point. Any other questions from the floor? Greg, any thoughts from you? No, I think we put the fear of God into everyone. I think now they've all gone away to look at their risk registers and their crisis plans.
Yeah, Mike, I think it was interesting the reference to the business continuity planning. It's a really difficult one. I think when you're trying to imagine all the potential worst case scenarios, it's easy to get carried away with all the potential scenarios that could materialize. But if you're focusing in on you'll know this yourself, focusing in on your key deliverables, what your key objectives are, what your critical activities are, and then protect them. So rather than saying there's a risk that a plane could fly into the World Trade Center, you would rather than get into the specifics of it, start looking at, well, something more vague could happen to the World Trade Center that could impact on the key activities there. And I think that's where you start to get a bit more surety as to how to protect against it. So it might not be specific protecting against planes flying into it, but it'll be protecting against business interruption.
Absolutely, Graham. No, I totally agree. It's not the precise scenario that you're testing people on. It's as Jennifer says, that ability to expand imaginations, to think much wider. And you know, there's classic examples through the years of organisations that have been myopic in crisis and ceased to exist 12 months later, and those that have just made decisions and been honest around what they did and what they didn't know. And British Midland versus Pan Am in the 1980s. There's Perrier versus Coca-Cola. There's loads of examples of organisations, and it's just, and in a crisis scenario, it's just getting people to make the most pragmatic decisions and make them quickly so that they can get ahead of the crisis. No, it's a very complex area.
Same thing. It's in these crises, it's not only the ability to make those decisions, it's the speed at which you're able to make those decisions, which has allowed for business continuity.
Yeah. No, excellent. And again, for us, how do we use all of this information to try and help organisations when, you know, they're dismissing risks in the future? Are they going to overstate the probability of a new viral attack so that we have to, you know, invest in infrastructure in everybody's home so that, you know, it's a bit like Y2K, isn't it? And the amount of investment that was put into precautionary measures should the it wasn't a virus, was it? But it was the failure of machines through the 2000 time change.
Good point.
And we put this massive investment in. And then none of it was needed, apparently. So, and for years afterwards, you know, I still hear people talk, oh my God, risk managers being pessimistic again. This is another Y2K scenario. and the counterbalance between, you know, that attitude towards a Y2K scenario which didn't occur and a COVID-19 which did occur, we're constantly trying to deal with that subjective view as to what's important, what's not important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the COVID crisis has served to highlight things that really are important and things that perhaps weren't quite as important. I mean, you touched on it earlier, the capacity for people to work remotely. And I think that's been a bit of an issue as the technology has developed. I think managers have had a bit of trouble trusting that people are going to be able to go away and get on with their work and still be productive and still be collaborative. But I think there have definitely been some positives to come out of this.
Absolutely, yeah. And hopefully organisations will look back and see whether there has been a drop in productivity, whether there's been a drop in profitability on the basis of what's gone on. And if there is no discernible drop, then you would say, well, actually, our worries about people being less productive are unfounded. Mm-hmm. Or they were ineffective whilst they were sitting in the office space, which is probably more likely. I've always felt that if people are going to be ineffective working from home, they're probably ineffective in the office space as well. So,
probably so.
Brilliant.
That we've kind of developed in this working from home environment isn't so much of the productivity of things getting done. It's the cyber risk that comes with having everyone potentially working from personal devices. And you know, as soon as you're opening up a company email on a personal device, you now have much less security protecting all of the box, you know, that you upload all of your files to in your cloud server. So that's one of the things that we're looking into quite a lot.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you very much. We've got 10 minutes left. What I'd propose to do, I think we've had to have a few people have had to drop off. What I'd propose to do is just spend a few minutes talking about what we as a special interest group might want to focus on for the next 3 to 6 months, whether there's any initiative we'd like to undertake, whether there's any publication, perhaps sort of a, just a 1 or 2 page advice note on what we think would be beneficial to either projects or business communities. What's people's thoughts in terms of what we might be able to do to make a difference? Okay, thanks for that. I was deafened by the response there.
So how do you mean, Mike? Do you mean as
could possibly do as a community is the risks that are going on with COVID-19? They're coming from lots of different sources. Everyone's explaining it in a different way, and I think IRM is a very trusted source. So if you were able to kind of distill what's happening and the risks to businesses in one place that's written in a language that people understand, which is how these reports are always written, I think that could be of a lot of use for key takeaways of the businesses that have maybe come out as winners in this situation.
Great. And I know you, Jennifer, the business school has been working with the IRM to produce some notes, so perhaps we could work together on that.
Yeah, I'd be really keen to contribute to that, actually. Yeah.
I'm not in the position to agree to things for on behalf, but I'd be more than happy to be putting that forward.
Great.
Cool.
Okay.
I think the guys at Houston we have did some work on the H1N1 crisis a while back, so there might be some kind of transferable lessons learned to throw into the mix there.
Happy to participate in that conversation if you would like, for sure. But we've we worked on predicting whether H1N1 was likely to become a pandemic before the World Health Organization declared it to be such.
Excellent. Oh, that'd be really interesting. I think Greg's had to drop off. I can't see him on the list anymore. Nodes and Links, which he's the CEO of, also did quite an interesting piece on COVID-19 in around March. So I'm sure he'd be interested in participating as well.
Cool.
Other thoughts? When should we try and get together again? I think we try and meet every 3 months. So if people are comfortable with that, we could set something up in around September time.
Yep, absolutely. That works for me. I'd like to be involved.
Okay.
At the center.
Excellent. No, that's fantastic. Well, in the absence of anything else, any final questions from anybody?
May I just ask a question? Would it be useful for me to share some information with you to distribute potentially?
Absolutely, yes. No, that'd be great. Yeah, no,
sure.
Please. Yep, and there are many more people who have been involved with the SIG and express interest who haven't joined in the call today. So that would be very useful for them to understand what we've been talking about and potentially contact you for more information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Today to go through everything with all of you, but please feel free to check out the information from our risk summit that we had earlier in the week, because we have each of our specialists who go into the geopolitical, governance, financial, cyber, all of the different risks that we look at in response to COVID-19. And I think everyone all together does quite a good job.
Oh, absolutely. I was on the summit and I found it fascinating. There were some great insights from companies and academics into what people could do differently. It was brilliant. Oh, definitely, yes. Yep.
Yeah, definitely check that out.
I'd also commend that work by Professor Hand on dark matter. I found that fascinating to explore, what we don't know and what the potential influence of what we don't know is on our decisions.
Is that HAND?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy, actually. The fact that that's such a huge percentage of everything that we're aware of, we're not actually aware of it.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, I'll close there. I think final comments from me. Thank you everyone for attending and participating, and particular thanks to Elizabeth for the fascinating presentation on what you're doing on trying to make more informed decision making. And thank you very much, Jennifer, for your contributions on how businesses are dealing with complexity. There's clearly lots of work for us to get stuck into.
Pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Great. Well, in the absence of any other comments or questions, I propose to close there. I'll give you 5 minutes of your day back. Who says risk always goes badly?
Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.